So let's return to this wheel of life, the Bhava Chakra diagram. So we saw that this diagram is describing how we are stuck in this cycle of existence called Samsara. That if we go right to the middle, we see that the underlying root cause are these three poisons, in particular the fundamental ignorance symbolized by the pig, and from that leads to attachment symbolized by the rooster and aversion by the snake. And these mental afflictions are driving our behavior. We engage in both virtuous and non-virtuous harmful behavior, the white and black actions, and these actions then lead to the various experiences, in particular the various types of existence that are possible within the cycle of existence called samsara. And so we have one part of the diagram left to talk about, which is the outer ring, which has a sequence of 12 diagrams, and these are called the 12 links of dependent origination. And these links describe how we cycle life after life due to ignorance. So let's have a look at these 12 links and see if we can make some sense of them. So if we start up at about 1 o'clock here, we see a little diagram here of a person with a stick in their hand. So this is a blind person. And so this is symbolizing ignorance, meaning we are blinded by ignorance. We're not really seeing where we're going. And due to that ignorance, of course, we have mental afflictions arising, and they are driving our behavior. And so those actions are symbolized in link 2 here, where we see the diagram is a person on a potter's wheel with spinning clay, and they're forming a pot. And here what we are saying is that the actions we do now are literally forming what our future existence is going to look like. And so that's the symbolism here of the potter's wheel. And this second link is often translated as this formative actions, meaning that they are literally forming what our future is going to look like. And then the third link here, which is symbolized by a monkey in front of a house, and in theory the house should have 5 windows and a door, is that the monkey is symbolizing our mind, and the 5 windows and a door are symbolizing the 5 sense faculties and the mental faculty, meaning our mind is constantly jumping between the different sense faculties and the mental faculty. And so we often hear an expression, the crazy monkey mind. Our mind is jumping all over the place. So this third link of consciousness, of course, is once we do an action from link 2, motivated by ignorance and mental afflictions, that action is imprinted on the mind, on the consciousness. And so that imprint of that action is carried on the consciousness. And then one of those imprints ripen, and that's going to determine the future existence. So when that imprint ripens, and it ripens as the future existence, and here we're using the example of, I think in general, a human existence, is that the future existence begins when the mind conjoins with the fertilized egg in the womb, i.e. mind and body come together. And that is symbolized here by link 4, called name and form. So name is mind, form is body, and that is symbolized here by some people in a boat. The boat is symbolizing the body. So the body is the vessel, and within that vessel we have the mind, and the mind is symbolized by the people in the boat. Sometimes you see 1 person, 2, 3, even 4 people. But collectively the people are symbolizing the mind. So that's symbolizing the beginning of the new existence when the mind and body can join. So we have name and form. And then, of course, that fertilized egg in the womb starts to develop. The embryo and fetus start to develop. And that leads to link number 5 here. And link number 5 here is called the 6 sense spheres. And so again, this should be symbolized by a house with 5 windows and a door. The 5 windows are the 5 sense faculties, and the door is the mental faculty. So in the development of the fetus, then at some point the sense faculties become operational. And when the sense faculties become operational, then they contact their respective objects. So that is link number 6 here. So link number 6 here is contact, and contact here is sort of graphically symbolized by a couple making love. So there's a lot of contact going on there. And so when we contact the respective objects through the respective sense faculties, then we experience that object as either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So that is feeling. So that is link number 7 here, the mental factor of feeling. And here, this is also quite graphically symbolized by a person with an arrow stuck in their eye. So there's quite a lot of feeling going on there. And as we saw, from feeling, particularly if we have a pleasant feeling, comes craving and attachment. So that is link number 8 and 9. So link 8 here is craving, and that is symbolized by a person with some alcohol, so they're craving alcohol. And then the next link, link 9 here, is grasping, and that is symbolized by a monkey grasping fruit from the tree. So the difference between craving and grasping is that first we crave something, and then we actively grasp and try to get that thing. So that grasping is the next stage from craving. Now this craving and grasping here in these 12 links are very specific type of craving and grasping, and this is referring to craving and grasping that happens at the time of death. That as we're going through the death process, we are craving and grasping to life itself because it seems like we're going out of existence. So then we're craving and grasping to life itself, and that craving and grasping to life itself causes one of these imprints in our mind to become activated. And so that is link number 10 here, called becoming or existence. And that is symbolized here by a pregnant woman about to give birth. So that imprint is now being activated. And so that imprint that is activated in the death process is going to determine now what the future life is going to be. And so then that activated imprint, of course, then ripens as the new life. And the new life, of course, is birth. And so here, link 11 is birth, and this is symbolized by a woman actually giving birth. And then, of course, what follows after birth is aging and death, which is link 12. And link 12 here is symbolized by an old person carrying a sack on their back. And in the sack is a corpse, carrying a corpse. So this is symbolizing aging and death. So what we can see from this is that we are stuck in the cycle of birth, aging and death due to this fundamental ignorance. So that is very briefly these 12 links. Now, just to explain a couple more things about these 12 links, and then maybe there'll be some questions, is these 12 links, these cycles, there are a number of these operating concurrently. For example, there is one cycle that we're in at the moment where we're playing out now these links of feeling, grasping, craving, and the link 12 of aging and death. So we're in currently one cycle which we are completing now. But at the same time, we're beginning other cycles because we're doing actions that are now starting cycle in terms of ignorance and link 2 and link 3. So there are a number of cycles of 1, 2 and 3 beginning in this life, while there's one that's ending. So how long does it take for one cycle to play out? Technically, we could do it in 2 lives, meaning in the past life, we had ignorance, we did something, that created an imprint in our life, in our mind, connected to our mind, and then at the end of that life, that very imprint that we created in that life got activated, and now we are playing out the result of that in terms of these links of feeling, craving, grasping, and aging, and birth, aging, and death. But more likely is that the imprint that is now playing out in this life was actually first created in an earlier life. So usually they say that normally it takes 3 or more lives for one cycle to play out, although technically it could be just 2 cycles. We started the cycle in the last life, creating imprint, and now we're playing that out. 2 consecutive lives, or it could have been over more lives. Both possibilities. And here, of course, in this cycle, we are talking about, similar to that, the suffering and its causes. We talked about that in the first 2 Noble Truths. We said the underlying cause of dukkha, this situation we find ourselves in, is mental afflictions and actions. So we have 3 elements here. We have mental afflictions leading to actions, i.e. karma, leading to the result of dukkha. So those 3 elements, of course, are the 12 links. So which of these 12 elements, which of these 12 links is the mental afflictions? Which of the 12 are mental afflictions? So link 1, any other link is mental affliction? Craving and grasping. So link 1, 8 and 9 are mental afflictions. Mental afflictions lead to karma, to actions. Which are karma or actions?
Link 2.
Link 2?
No, it's actually what we decided.
Sorry? Link 2, yeah, link 2 is action. Any other links? No. Other numbers. Number 1? 0. Oh, okay. Oh, okay, okay. No. Yeah, move it 1. So, is there anything else apart from link 2 that is karma or action?
5 is not?
No.
Karma is, well, the way you die is karmatic, no? Aging, no? 6.
No.
No.
Which of these 12 links is karma? Link 2? No. Becoming, link 10. Remember, link 10 is the activated imprint, the one that's the karmic imprint that is activated at the time of death. So this link 10 is karma, is activated imprint. So link 2 and 10 is karma, and then of course the rest, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 11 and 12 is dukkha, the result. So that's how the 3 elements are represented in these 12 links. Now, another question, another point.
How do we get out here?
You can't.
So, therefore, we have in these 12 links what's called the forward order and the reverse order. The forward order we can see that is due to ignorance, we're stuck in birth, aging and death. But if we do the reverse order, we can see how do we overcome each link is we overcome the previous one, so we go back and we overcome ignorance. So that the forward order shows us how we're stuck in samsara, the reverse order shows us how to break free of samsara. We need to go back and eliminate ignorance. Now, The question, of course, that often arises here is we are talking about the cycle of life. But the question is, what goes from life to life? Because any tradition that talks about life after life has to say, what is it that goes from life to life? Of course, in Christianity, we talk about soul going to heaven and hell. And in other traditions at the time of the Buddha, they talked about this Atman that was sort of going from life to life and achieving liberation. So here the question is, what is the Buddhist assertion of what goes from life to life? And often you will hear people say, according to Buddhism, it's the mental consciousness or subtle mental continuum or something. Technically, this is inaccurate, wrong. We have to go back to the question. The question is a bit misleading because the question says, what goes from life to life? Implying there's something that moves through time. The word go. But if we look at the physical world, is there anything in the physical world that moves through time? Nothing. It's not, nothing moves through time. There is just physical change, isn't there? So there is no static entity in the physical universe that is moving through time. There's just a flow of change. And within that flow of change, we create phenomena to make sense of the flow of change. We have to do that, so there's no problem with that. The problem is what we do, and here's our old friend cognitive fusion again, is there's flow of change, and then in that flow we sort of draw lines and create objects to make sense of the flow. Good, we have to do that. But we don't realise that's what we're doing. And what we do, what makes it difficult for us is we do the cognitive fusion. Because, like, for instance, here, there's just flow of change. And to help us understand that, we sort of draw a line around this particular part of the flow and we create cup. Good. But then we do cognitive fusion. We fuse the label cup, which of course is static and unchanging, to the changing basis. And we say this is a cup. And then suddenly there's something there, a cup, that's moving through time. No such thing. No such thing, is there? And impermanence. Same idea with impermanence. You know, we hear in Buddhism, we talk about impermanence. We hear that impermanence means things are changing moment by moment. Good, but what we do is this. That here we have the present moment, we have something, and in the next moment it changes. Is that impermanence? No, impossible. Because if we have a moment of time, no matter how small, where this is not changing, then it's not changing. And why would it change then if it's not changing? If it's not changing for that amount of time, why would it then suddenly change? This is not impermanence. But this is what we think. Impermanence is this, isn't it? But these are useful concepts. The idea of moments is a useful concept, but it's just a concept. If we fuse the concept to the basis, we end up with this idea, and then of course we're stuck, aren't we? And in fact, you know, we talked about, and we'll come to this a little bit later, is in the foundation level, the Theravada level, you know, the Vipassana practice, 3 insights: impermanence and no self. But impermanence, if we're very sharp and intuitive, when we realize impermanence, we'll realize this. If we realize this and not think it's this is this close to realizing emptiness. this close. Because if things are like this, where is there anything to be found there? There's nothing to be found there, is there? Nothing. But things exist. So realizing impermanence, if we're very intuitive, is very close to realizing emptiness. Very close. So back to the question. What goes from life to life? So what we've seen is at the physical world level, technically speaking, nothing moves through time. There's just change. Similarly, the mental level. If we don't look, we think, oh, my mind is moving through time. Just like superficially it seems like this cup is moving through time. But if we look closely, there's no cup there moving through time. There's just change. And to make sense of that change, we are constantly creating the idea cup. Useful, good. Similarly, at the mental level, if we don't look closely, we think, oh, my mind is moving through time. But if you look, then just like the physical world, we just have a flow of mental experience. And we label that mind. Useful, but it's just a label. But if we fuse mind, the label mind, to the basis, which is constantly changing, suddenly we have a static thing, mind, moving through time. Like we have a static thing, cup, moving through time. So what we can see is both at the physical level, mental level, nothing moves through time. So technically the question, what goes from life to life, is a loaded question. So technically the answer to that is nothing goes from life to life because nothing moves through time. But then of course we still have to answer that in a way. So technically to say that mental consciousness is what goes from life to life is mistaken. The reason we see that is that in Buddhism there are a number of philosophical systems. And this idea of emptiness is what's called the highest philosophical levels, called the Prasangika Madhyamika. And that idea of emptiness, as I mentioned earlier, means that things exist but they're not findable. There's big and small, but you can't find big there, you can't find small there. So for this philosophical system, nothing is findable. Whereas all the lower Buddhist schools say for something to exist, it must be findable. Therefore, what goes from life to life, they need to be able to point to something. And generally, most of them point to the mind or the mental consciousness, subtle mental continuum, and so forth. So for those schools, yes, we can say it's the subtle mental continuum. But for this school, the Prasangika, you cannot say that, because you can't point to anything that is the subtle mental continuum. So the answer from this school, what goes from life to life, the mere I.
Is no I. Back to the
Prasangika. What this means, of course, I just means person. So again, there's no Buddhist tradition that says there is no person. They're all interested in how does the person exist. And mere I is short for merely labelled I, merely labelled person. So again, the person that exists now, you can't find it. It exists as something labelled on the basis. Just like you can't find big or small, but big or small exist on the basis. Cup exists, but you can't find a cup there in the basis. We create the cup by drawing a line and creating it. There's no cup to be found there, but cup exists. Cup functions. Similarly, the person exists. Person is something merely labelled on the basis of the body and the mind. And at every point in our life, that is the case. Just like in every point in time, here we can talk about cup. But there's no cup moving through time. Like there's no person moving through time, static person. So the merely labeled person is the person that is merely labeled at every point in time. And that is what goes from life to life. But technically, it's not, we can't really say go.
So in the moment of conception,
Sorry?
the mere eye is...
The mere I at the moment of conception is the person that is labeled on the basis of the fertilized egg and the mind that is connected to that.
So the very subtle consciousness, it's the lower schools, the lower
Yeah.
philosophical schools.
Yeah.
But what is that thing that goes in the egg and...
Right.
So you have to...
Okay. Okay. Let's be a bit more expansive, then I have to really move on. Right, so... So this is our life. This is the continuum of the body, the continuum of the mind. So the person that exists at any point in time, let's say this is the present, is the merely labelled the person who's labelled on the mind that is existing now and the body that's existing now. Okay? And that's the same at every point. So there's no static person moving through time, just like there's no cup moving through time. But person at every point, labelled on the basis that's there at that time, the body and the mind. When we go through to the death process, we go through a number of stages. The first 4 stages, this coarse body and thereby the coarse mind is slowly shutting down. So at the first 4 stages of the death process, the person who's undergoing that is still the person labelled on this body and mind. At the end of the 4th stage, this coarse body has shut down. Therefore, the coarse mind has shut down. Over the next 3 stages, so that's the coarse. Over the next 3 stages, we have the subtle body and subtle mind that is associated with that are shutting down.
The four
Elements. Yeah.
three and the white.
Yeah, exactly. So the person here that is undergoing the process is still the merely labelled I. An I labelled on the basis of the subtle mind and subtle body. So of course here now the person is not human anymore, but it's still person. At the end of that 3 stages, the subtle body has shut down, therefore the subtle mind is shut down. So now we end up with, at the last stage, the very subtle body and mind, which is the very clear light mind and the very subtle wind energy associated with that. So the person at that point is a person labelled on those 2 elements. Then here, the mind disconnects from the body and enters into what's called the intermediate state, the bardo, between this and next life. And in the bardo, we take on a subtle body and a subtle mind. So this is the bardo, intermediate state, and there we have a subtle body and mind. So the person who's going through the bardo is person labelled on that subtle body and mind. So again, not human. And at the end of that period, then if the person who went through the death process here activated link 10, if link 10 here was activated to be a human, at the end of this period, that mind of the bardo being would connect with the fertilized egg in the womb. So here we have a coarse body already, and then the mind is associated with that. So the new life begins, and now we still have the mere I, the person, labelled on the fertilized egg in the womb, and the mind that is now connected with that. So now the person is human again. But at all stages, we have mere I. But it's not anything that is moving through time. There is an I, but you can't,
But the mind is...
There is an I, but you can't find it. Just like there's a cup, but you can't find the cup. There is person. Person is merely labelled on the basis. Huh?
No mercy, no Jewish man would say honestly.
In the end of the day. Should have said in the morning.
So that's all I wanted to talk about the 12 links. Any questions before we move on to the last two noble truths? Yeah, okay. So there's a number of philosophical systems in Buddhism, and I won't go into them, but there's one school called the Madhyamika, or middle way school. But within that, there's a sub-school called Prasangika. And so when I've been talking about this idea of emptiness, off and on in the last day or two, that's the view I'm following. The idea there's nothing exists independently.
Can I ask a small question? You say nothing moves on time.
Nothing static, no.
Nothing static. It reminds me that according to Zenon paradoxes,
To
Zenon was a Greek philosopher.
okay.
He said that nothing can move on the space because it's called the paradox of the half distance. If you want to reach from A to B, first of all you have to pass half of it. And then in order to pass half, you have to pass half. In other words, no movement. Does it have any connection or I'm just, blah, blah, blah?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly the reasoning he's using behind that, but certainly in sort of the founder of this philosophical system called Madhyamika, of course the Buddha taught this idea, but the person in ancient India who really established this as a system, the Madhyamika, was Nagarjuna in the 2nd century. And in his classic text on this, he has sort of arguments a little bit like this. He has arguments such as the one this idea. That if this is what you think, how does that work? Like the classic example, this is something to think about. And this is one I often bring up in this context. We talk about everything is produced through causes and conditions. And the example I give is the seed and the plant. So the seed produces the plant. And then the conditions are soil, sunlight, water, and so forth. And so the seed and plant are in a cause and effect relationship. And if two things are in a cause and effect relationship, by definition, they can't exist at the same time. The question is, does the seed stop existing before the plant comes into existence? And there's only two answers, yes or no. So does the seed stop existing before the plant comes into existence? If you say no, that means they exist at the same time. By definition, illogical. If you say yes, the seed has ceased to exist, where is the plant coming from? Yes is illogical. So both no and yes are illogical. Why? Because we are thinking it's like this. Because we are thinking things exist independently. Therefore, all of these arguments, all of these ideas, cause and effect and so forth, actually become completely illogical. They can't work. So I don't know if that's a little bit similar idea, I'm not sure.
I'm not sure either, but I think we are playing with language, but this is another
Sure.
conversation.
And of course, with this idea of emptiness is that we can never figure it out intellectually.
No, of course.
Because the problem that we've created is the conceptual dualistic mind. We won't be able to solve it with the same mind. We have to go beyond it.
I wanted to ask, you said that you can remember your past mind and bodies, or course, past minds and bodies. When you,
It's technically possible, yeah.
is it like, I've heard from people who did hypnosis, many people say that they could remember their past mind and body. Would you say that it's the same mind and body that someone who does Buddhism would remember, or it's just some, let's say...
Okay, there's a couple of things to say and then we really need to move on. One is that I think the mind is very powerful in terms of if you want to believe something, the mind can create something.
Yeah.
So personally, I think that a lot of people who say they remembered past lives or had out-of-body experiences, I think a large percentage of them are just hallucinations because the mind can create whatever we want to believe in. But from a Buddhist perspective, out-of-body experiences and remembering past lives is, of course, possible and they can be valid experiences. Now, what the thing is that when we have experiences, then we interpret those experiences based on our cultural background and so forth. So even though two people may have the same experience, the way they interpret them could be radically different. For example, an experience such as emptiness, and I think in all traditions they're sort of trying to get down to that. I think a Christian contemplative who has some non-dualistic experience may say they had a union with God. A Buddhist will say, I realized emptiness. A Vedanta may say, I had a non-dual experience or something. I don't know. So how people express those experiences would be very different. And sometimes it's not obvious they're actually talking about the same thing because of the way of understanding. And so certainly I think when it comes to past life memories, generally, and they've done quite a lot of scientific studies on people who claim to have that, and particularly it comes with young children. And I think the theory is that as a young child, you're not yet so heavily relating to this life, so you still can connect to those. And often these young children who they've studied, who have these memories which, apart from the idea of past life memory, would be very hard to explain how they know these things. And so they've done a lot of scientific studies on these. But generally these young children, by the time they're teenage years, they've lost that ability. And it's generally because they're now so much connected, identifying with this body and mind, they can't relate to those memories anymore. They've lost the ability to connect to them.
And has your research shown you that they
Not my research.
Or their research shown that they can clearly remember things that are real, like they remember things?
Yeah, they've done scientific studies of these young children, and they've done empirical tests about the memories, and apart from some idea of rebirth, how they would know that is very difficult to explain. And maybe there's some other explanation, but so far they haven't come up with any way of explaining why these children can have these, because sometimes we're talking about physically remote and a lot of details which are impossible for them to know. Of course, in their studies, and they're very scientific, in fact, the person who started these studies was trying to disprove the idea of rebirth. He was trying to show that it was just a fallacy. But through years of study, he came to the conclusion that actually there are cases, a number of cases, where it's difficult to explain apart from the idea of it being a past life memory. But anyway. Right. Let's move on then. And in the next session, of course, Chuki will give you a very good, and Nissam will give you a very good presentation on this in Hebrew. So get ready for that. Oh, no, Nissam, you're doing something else, but Chuki. Okay.
He can do both. You know that after that you stay with Shuki, so you have to be very gentle on him. Because he's staying here after that, so he's still...
No. He only be arranged not to stay here.
Okay.
I'm escaping this evening.
Now I understand why. It's much more complicated.
So we've looked at the first two noble truths, truth of dukkha and the cause of dukkha, and then now we've looked at the whole process of how we're stuck in that cycle. So let's now briefly look at the second two noble truths. The third one is truth of cessation, and the fourth is truth of path. So here we can look at the three vehicles chart again. So the third noble truth, truth of cessation, was the Buddhist prognosis that we can liberate ourselves, we can end all suffering and its causes, and that state of cessation is called Nirvana, which we've already looked at a little bit. And what we saw was that in the Mahayana, we can go one step further than that, and we can go on to striving for the goal of enlightenment. But let's now stay, because this weekend is about Samsara and Nirvana, so let's stay within that bandwidth. So here we saw that then the fourth noble truth, truth of the path, is the cure, the medicine. What practices do we need to engage in to achieve this goal of Nirvana? And here, in the Theravada traditions, that is normally presented as this eightfold path. These 8 practices we can see here: right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, concentration, view, and thought. And those 8 practices can be condensed into these 3 core areas of the 3 higher trainings: ethics, concentration, wisdom. So here, right speech, right action, right livelihood is ethics. Right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration is subsumed as concentration, and then right view and right thought is subsumed as wisdom. So what we see here is that the core practices that we need to engage in achieving nirvana is ethics, concentration, wisdom. So ethics here, of course, at this level, is the core of ethics is avoiding harmful, non-virtuous behavior. Concentration is to develop the single-pointed concentration, because we need single-pointed concentration for the wisdom practice. Because, as I've mentioned a number of times, I think, already, we go through 3 stages in a practice, any practice. And here I like to use the Tibetan words because they're very short. Go, nyam, tok. Go in Tibetan means intellectual. So first we get an intellectual idea about something, impermanence, emptiness, or whatever, because then we've got a framework for our practice. We know what we're practicing then. But then, of course, just merely intellectually understanding these things itself is not really going to help a lot. We need to then internalize that. We need to meditate. And if we meditate, we can come to taste and experience these things, impermanence, emptiness, and so on. And that is nyam. Nyam means taste or experience. And if we sit down and we meditate on impermanence or emptiness, we may have a taste of it. And it could be quite a profound experience. And the more that we have an experience in meditation, the more that penetrates our mind, the more it will have a residual effect after the meditation. Maybe only for a few moments, a few minutes, a few hours, maybe even a few days or even a few weeks. But eventually that will wear off and we'll go back to the normal way of seeing things. But during the time we have that taste or experience, it's still affecting the mind, we're going to notice the benefit. For example, if we're meditating on emptiness and we have some little emptiness experience, and that's still affecting our mind after the meditation, during that time, what you're going to notice is that your mental afflictions will be less than normal, your mind will be generally more calm than normal, and you'll feel more connected to others. And then eventually that'll wear off and we'll back to normal habits. So what we want to do is we want to stabilize this experience so it's more long-lasting. To do that, we need to go to the next level of tok, which is realization. So what this means is that, for example, emptiness, if we want to directly realize emptiness, we need a very stable and clear mind. We need this concentration practice, the shamatha practice in the Mahayana, or in the Theravada, it's often called the jhana practice. We need to develop that level of concentration to move from here to here. And if we can realize emptiness, that's a stable experience, longer and long-lasting experience. It's not going to just wear off very quickly. So that's why here we need the concentration practice as a basis of the wisdom practice. And here, as we saw earlier, the wisdom practice is also called in Sanskrit vipassana, or in Pali vipassana, just meaning insight. And here we have the 3 marks of existence. So these are the 3 main insights we are developing in the Vipassana practice in the Theravada to achieve the goal of Nirvana. So the first insight is the insight into impermanence. So if we can really internalize this idea, intellectual idea of impermanence, if we can come to taste and experience that, or even better, realize that, you'll find that immediately your life will be a lot better. That your craving and attachment to pleasant things, aversion to unpleasant things will dramatically decrease, dramatically. And as I said, if we really come to have a realization of impermanence, and we're very intuitive, we're this close to realizing emptiness, actually. And then the second insight here is insight into suffering or dukkha. So if we can really gain an insight into the state we find ourselves in, particularly the most subtle level, this all-pervasive dukkha, if we can come to realize this, we will realize the source of suffering and happiness is not out there, it's in here. And from that experience, we'll be able to develop this renunciation or nisarana. Once we've developed this nisarana or renunciation, the aspiration for nirvana, then we really need to strive for nirvana, and that, of course, is this wisdom of no self. To come to realize we do not exist in this overinflated false way, that there is no self here. That doesn't mean, of course, there's no person. It just means that there's nothing in addition to the body and the mind. There's nothing more than body and mind here. And if we can realize there's no such self, then according to the Theravada tradition, that is the fundamental ignorance. From that, we'll be able to eliminate all mental afflictions and suffering and achieve nirvana. Now, of course, if you go on, talk to the Madhyamika people, the Prasangika people, they would say, not really. They'd say, if you realize no self, very good, very helpful. But there's a deeper level of ignorance than that. That the deepest level of ignorance that we need to realize to achieve nirvana, of course, is we need to realize emptiness. So all the lower philosophical systems in Buddhism again, they all say the same, that no self, you realize that, nirvana. Prasangika says, no. Good if you realize that, but it's not enough because there's a deeper level of ignorance you haven't touched yet. And that is grasping onto independent me, independent world, the subject-object duality. That is the fundamental ignorance that we need to eliminate to achieve nirvana. Any questions? Wow, okay.
It might sound really naive, but to develop your shamatha practice, all you have to do is just do it consistently, let's say, and increase the time. That's it. That's it.
Okay. There's a lot to be said here. I'll try and be sort of condensed and brief. As with anything in life, if we want to become good at something, we need to practice. I mean, that goes without saying, you know, in anything we do in our life. But certainly in terms of, and shamatha is no different. And like everything, it's better to practice every day than a massive amount once a month or something, you know. So continuity, of course. And here, of course, the emphasis is quality over quantity. Meaning, as a beginner, it's much better to practice in a focused way for 20 minutes than sit there for an hour and just getting half asleep and daydreaming. Because actually that is increasing the very thing you're trying to overcome. So it's counterproductive. So we always emphasize quality over quantity. But of course, as with everything, if we want to go deeper, we need to increase the amount of time we meditate, but always emphasizing quality over quantity. So we start with where we are, whatever we can manage, and then as we go deeper, we'll need to expand that out more. But of course, every practice has two parts, meditation and what we do for the rest of the day. So if we're diligently doing our shamatha meditation every morning, but then we jump up and run around like crazy the rest of the day, mindlessly, which is going to win out? 30 minutes of mindful shamatha or 14 hours of mindless running around and getting stressed? I mean, which one is really going to win out? So we need to integrate. So yes, we need to do the shamatha meditation to start the day in a good way and to really boost the mindfulness, but then we need to continue to work on the mindfulness through the day. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So if we do those two things together, we can progress. But also, of course, on top of that, it's good to every so often get a boost through doing a retreat. So particularly as a beginner, very helpful to do group retreat. Because if we try and do a little bit of solitary retreat, at our beginner level, we're not very disciplined, self-motivating, and there's too many distractions, and it's very difficult. Whereas if you go to a group retreat for a few days or a week or so, it's led, there's structure, you just have to turn up, and then you get the group energy. So, exactly. So then if you can do that once or twice a year for a few days or a week, get a boost, it'll bring your practice to a sort of another level. And then you can get inspired and so forth. And then together with that, I think it's essential to have Sangha, community. Because if we try and do it on our own, my experience and many people I talk to, difficult if not impossible. Because we're not self-disciplined, and then we feel like we're the only one doing this, everyone else is doing something opposite, and we just give up. I mean, that's basically what happens. So it's a bit like the analogy of, you know, and I think Nissim can relate to this, you know, if you've planted some seeds in the garden and you have a little sprout coming up out of the ground, if you want that to grow to a big healthy plant, you need to do two things. You need to protect it so it doesn't get trampled or eaten by animals, and then you need to nurture it. You need to water it and fertilize it. So similarly, if we have something sprouting in our mind, we need to do two things. We need to protect and nurture. Protect means to, again, as I mentioned earlier, avoid heavy negative influences in our life, and then surround ourselves with people, like-minded people, and get nurtured through that. So I think these things are very important if we want shamatha or any practice to develop.
To develop, yeah, to continue with it.
What?
He said, "Did you hear that?" I don't know what he's meaning by that. Meaning you're supposed to do something.
What is this? My lawyer is talking now.
We have a Sangha.
What is this?
We have retreat.
יש סנגה.
Yes.
Oh, see, Sangha right here.
We have
Oh,
to keep
very
on
good.
going. Yeah.
Very good. Any other question? Otherwise, it's nearly time for afternoon tea. But yeah.
Did you say that when you practice impermanence or you get closer to
Emptiness.
you get closer to people? You
Right.
get, because I tell you what I feel, like
Right.
it's many years that I don't want, that my social needs are lesser, my social needs, I don't need to see so much people as
Right.
I really don't want, because it's
Right.
because you get gossip and.
Sure. Now, there's two things here. So,
really,
yeah, exactly.
Would like
So,
to be alone.
right, exactly. But what we're talking about here is mental attitude versus behavior. So yes, you probably find that if you go into this sort of lifestyle, you know, just this sort of gossip, chat, you'll go,
That's what people do.
I'm not interested in that. And so you'll move back from that. But
Try to-
yeah, wait.
try.
Yeah. But this is simply not being interested in wasting our life.
Yes, sure.
What we're talking about here is our mental attitude towards people.
Yeah, you help more, you...
Exactly. So we're not talking about we need to spend more time with people. We're talking about how do we relate to people mentally. Exactly. So this is a sign that actually our emptiness practice is going well. If we find that we're doing shamatha or vipassana practice and we're finding that we're withdrawing because we don't want to be connected in the world at all, this is very unhealthy. This is a sure sign our practice is going horribly astray. Because this is what often people do, particularly with the shamatha practice, is they start to get a little bit of taste of this peace and quiet, and they go, oh, that's so nice. And they withdraw into that so they don't have to deal with all that mess out there. This is very unhealthy. But what we're talking about is that if we particularly do the Vipassana practice of emptiness, a sign that if we have some experience that that is a valid experience, a sign is that when we see other people, particularly if they suffer, what is our instinctive reaction to that? Are we instinctively more compassionate, or are we just, often people feel that Buddhism is that we're supposed to have this blank mind when we're faced. This is very unhealthy. So we're not talking about we need to go out and spend all of our time chatting, but what we're talking about is when we see other people, particularly if we see them suffering, are we feeling much more instinctively compassion? If we are, this is a very good sign that the emptiness practice is going well. Because, remember, emptiness is saying there's no duality. Now, we feel if there's a me here and a them there. There's this sort of gap or barrier or distance. And so then to develop loving kindness and compassion for others fully, very difficult, because there's sort of like, well, there's a me and then them. Whereas if we realize emptiness, we'll realize there's no boundary in the entire universe. Just like there's big and small, but there's not big and small. It's not two different things. And so by realizing emptiness, we'll realize there's no gap or distance. And so the expression of emptiness, the spontaneous expression of emptiness is loving kindness and compassion. It is that. And so if we start to have that naturally without thinking, very good sign we're heading in the right direction. Okay, afternoon tea break.